I invited my parents and siblings to a luxurious Thanksgiving dinner, a feast that cost me $15,000, prepared by a Michelin-starred chef in a home they did not even know I owned. But that day, not a single one of them showed up. They abandoned me and gathered elsewhere. I sat there alone, eating in humiliation. Then my grandfather walked in and placed a manila envelope in my hand. I opened it, and the truth left me completely stunned. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Please hit subscribe and like this video to find out how that single envelope changed my family dynamic forever. My name is Maya Davenport, and I am 32 years old. I stood in the grand dining room of my new custom-built mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta. The long mahogany table was set for 12. Crystal glasses caught the warm amber light from the modern chandelier overhead. The scent of roasted turkey truffle, mashed potatoes, and honey-glazed carrots filled the air. I had hired a private chef to curate the perfect menu. It was a lavish evening designed to finally prove to my family that I had made it. I wanted to show them that the daughter they always dismissed as just a public relations worker had built an empire of her own. But as the antique grandfather clock chimed 6 times, the perfectly arranged chairs remained completely empty. For my entire life, I was the outsider in my own home. My parents, Patricia and Marcus Jr., worshipped at the altar of social status. To them, success was measured by marrying well and joining the right country clubs. My older sister Chloe did exactly that. She married Julian Sterling, a wealthy hedge fund manager. Julian was arrogant, condescending, and white, which for some reason made my parents treat him like royalty. They saw him as their golden ticket into the elite upper crust of Atlanta society. Whenever Julian spoke, my parents listened as if he were delivering a sermon. Whenever I spoke about my crisis management firm, they would pat my hand and tell me to stop playing games and find a good husband. I checked my phone for the 10th time. The screen remained blank. The private chef stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and gently asked if we should start serving the appetizers. I forced a polite smile and asked him to give us 15 more minutes. My heart hammered against my ribs. Did they get the wrong address? Did they get caught in holiday traffic on Peachtree Road? Then my phone buzzed against the cold marble countertop. It was a text message from my mother. I picked up the phone, my hands suddenly clammy with anxiety. The message read, "Maya, we are eating Thanksgiving dinner at Julian and Chloe Penthouse. Your place is just too far out of the way. Besides, Julian just closed a massive investment project and we really needed to celebrate his success. You can just eat whatever you bought at the grocery store by yourself. Happy Thanksgiving." I read the message 3 times. The words blurred together as tears threatened to spill over my carefully applied makeup. They did not even have the decency to call me. They waited until the exact moment dinner was supposed to start to tell me they were never coming. The excuse about my house being too far was a blatant lie. Buckhead was a premier neighborhood barely 20 minutes from their own home. The truth was far more simple and much more cruel. They chose Julian fictional success over my reality. They chose Chloe manufactured perfect life over their own daughter who had spent weeks preparing a celebration for them. I walked into the kitchen and told the chef he could go home early. I paid him his full rate, tipped him generously, and watched him leave through the massive glass front doors. The silence in the house was deafening. I walked over to the head of the table and sat down. I looked at the incredible feast spread out before me. The roasted meats, the artisan breads, the expensive vintage wines breathing in crystal decanters. I reached for my wineglass and took a slow, trembling sip. The vintage Bordeaux tasted like bitter ashes in my mouth. I stared at the empty chair to my right. That was where my mother was supposed to sit. I had placed a custom-engraved name card right above her plate. I remembered how she used to drag me to Chloe beauty pageants when we were kids. My mother would spend hours curling Chloe hair and fixing her makeup while telling me to just go sit quietly in the back row so I would not ruin my sister big moment. That dynamic never changed. Even when I paid off my parents' mortgage 3 years ago, Anonymously through a trust, they credited their good fortune to God and Julian financial advice. They never once suspected the daughter they belittled was the one keeping a roof over their heads. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn a seat at their table. I built a multi-million-dollar company from the ground up, fighting twice as hard as anyone else just to be taken seriously as a black woman in the corporate world. Yet in my own family, I was still just Maya the disappointment, the girl who did not marry a rich man, the girl whose hard work was completely invisible to the people who were supposed to love her most. I set my wine glass down with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the empty dining room, mocking my foolish attempt to win their affection. I had decorated the entire house. I had hired a string quartet that I canceled just moments ago. I had done everything perfectly. But perfection was never the issue. The issue was me. To them, I would never belong. I sat alone in my $15 million mansion, surrounded by wealth and success, feeling more abandoned than a stray dog on the street. I reached for my phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen, unable to tear my eyes away from my mother-cruel message. I needed to see what was so important that they threw me away on Thanksgiving night. I unlocked my phone and tapped the Instagram icon. The first thing that popped up at the top of my feed was a glowing pink ring around Chloe's profile picture. She was broadcasting live to her 50,000 followers. I tapped the circle. The screen filled with the bright, sterile lighting of Julian and Chloe penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. It was a flashy space, all glass and chrome, decorated exactly how you would expect a man who bought his personality from a luxury catalog to live. Chloe's face dominated the frame. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled into sleek waves. She held a glass of champagne, flashing her oversized diamond ring directly at the camera lens. "Happy Thanksgiving, everybody!" She cooed into the microphone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are just so incredibly blessed this year. I wanted to share this beautiful family moment with all of you." She flipped the camera around to show the dining room. There sat my parents, Patricia and Marcus Jr., dressed to the nines, laughing as if they did not have a care in the world. And standing at the head of the table, wielding a carving knife like it was a scepter, was Julian. He wore a tailored vest, looking incredibly smug. "Are we live, babe?" Julian asked, flashing a bright, practiced smile at the camera. He plunged the carving fork into the perfectly browned turkey. "I just want to say how thankful I am for this amazing family, and for a meal fit for actual professionals. Thank God we dodged a bullet tonight." Chloe giggled, a high and grating sound. "What do you mean, honey?" Julian scoffed, slicing into the meat. "Well, we almost had to drag ourselves all the way out to Maya Place. Can you imagine the disaster? She probably just stopped by the discount grocery store and microwaved some frozen dinners. You know how she is. She barely has time to manage those little internet scandals for her clients, let alone host a real holiday dinner. We needed a space with actual class tonight to celebrate my new venture fund." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, my fingers gripping the edges of my phone so tightly they ached. It was one thing to abandon me. It was another thing entirely to publicly humiliate me for their own entertainment. But the absolute worst part was not Julian. It was the sound of my own parents laughing in the background. The camera panned to my mother. Patricia took a delicate sip of her wine and nodded in agreement. "Oh, Julian, you are terrible," she said, though her face beamed with approval. "But you are absolutely right. Maya never was domestic. She is too busy playing boss at her little public relations firm to learn how to maintain a certain standard of living. She just does not understand the kind of pressure and high-level networking that a man like you deals with." My father chimed in, raising his crystal glass toward his son-in-law. "To Julian, thank you for giving our daughter the life she deserves and for keeping this family anchored in true success." I watched Julian soak up the praise, a white man sitting at the head of a black family table being worshipped like a deity simply because he threw around venture capital jargon. They revered him. Meanwhile, they completely erased the fact that I had built a crisis management empire from absolute scratch. They dismissed my massive corporate contracts as little internet scandals. They belittled my entire existence just to inflate Julian ego. Comments began rolling in on the live stream. Chloe followers were eating it up. Someone asked where I was. Chloe brought the camera back to her own face and sighed heavily, putting on a mask of deep sisterly concern. "A lot of you are asking about Maya," Chloe said, lowering her voice as if sharing a heavy burden. "We really try with her, we do. But she is just going through a tough phase. It is hard for her to be around us when Julian is achieving so much and providing such a beautiful life for me. She gets very defensive. Her energy can be incredibly draining, and tonight is about positivity. We just wanted to surround ourselves with high vibrations, you know." A sharp physical pain shot through my chest. The sheer audacity of her lies was paralyzing. I had not been draining. I had not been defensive. I had spent $15,000 of my own hard-earned money to give them a night of absolute luxury. I had curated a menu, hired a string quartet, and bought the finest wines. I had prepared a seat of honor for my mother. And there she was, broadcasting to thousands of strangers that I was a bitter, jealous failure who could not afford a proper meal. They were spinning a narrative that made me the villain of my own life. They needed me to be the broken, pathetic scapegoat so that Chloe could shine brighter, so that Julian could feel superior, so that my parents could justify their blind, toxic favoritism. I dropped the phone onto the marble table. The screen shattered against the hard stone, but the audio kept playing. The sound of their clinking glasses and raucous laughter echoed through my quiet, empty mansion. The contrast was suffocating. I sat in a house worth $15 million, surrounded by undeniable proof of my success, yet I had never felt more worthless. A wave of cold, biting fury washed over me. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a burning anger that settled deep in my bones. I looked at the extravagant feast sitting untouched on my table. I looked at the shattered phones still broadcasting their joyous betrayal. I did not want to cry anymore. I wanted to burn their perfectly constructed fake world straight to the ground. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I smoothed down the fabric of my tailored dress and took a deep, steadying breath. I was done waiting for a seat at their table. I was done begging for scraps of affection from people who used my pain as a punchline. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the grand foyer swung open. The sharp, unmistakable sound of a wooden cane striking the marble floor echoed through the silent house. Step, thud, step, thud. I turned around sharply, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing in the archway of the dining room was the last person I ever expected to see tonight. What will happen when my grandfather reveals the secret he brought with him? Grandpa Marcus stood in the arched doorway of my dining room. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture impeccably straight despite his 78 years. His silver-handled cane struck the marble floor with a rhythmic, authoritative thud as he stepped fully into the light. He did not look like an old man showing up for a family dinner. He looked like a king inspecting his territory. I wiped a stray tear from my cheek, suddenly feeling very small in my massive house. "Grandpa?" I breathed out, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here? I thought you went with everyone else to the penthouse." He stopped at the edge of the dining table and let out a low, rumbling scoff. He glanced down at my shattered phone on the floor, where Chloe's voice was still faintly broadcasting her toxic live stream. Then he looked at the magnificent, untouched feast spread across the mahogany table. He reached out with a steady hand, picked up the crystal decanter of vintage Bordeaux, and poured himself a glass. He took a slow sip, savoring the flavor before looking back at me. "A 1982 vintage," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "A masterpiece of a wine. It is a damn shame you intended to waste it on people who would not know the difference between this and cheap boxed wine from a corner store." He walked toward me, his cane tapping a steady beat. I watched him completely bewildered. My grandfather, Marcus Davenport Sr., was a self-made real estate mogul who had built his wealth from the ground up in Atlanta during a time when the odds were lethally stacked against black men. He was a man of few words, sharp instincts, and zero tolerance for foolishness. "I did not go to Julian's pathetic excuse for a dinner party," my grandfather said, stopping just a few feet away from me. I would rather eat dirt than sit at a table funded by smoke and mirrors listening to my own son and his wife worship a mediocre white man who wears his arrogance like a cheap cologne. The sheer bluntness of his words sent a jolt through my system. I had always assumed my grandfather tolerated Julian the way the rest of the family did. I had no idea he saw right through the polished facade. I looked down at my hands. I wanted to impress them. I admitted the lingering hurt making my voice tremble. I bought this house. I hired the chef. I just wanted them to see that I am not a failure. I wanted them to be proud of me for once. Grandpa Marcus slammed the base of his cane against the floor. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the room, making me jump. "Stand up, Maya," he commanded. His tone was not angry, but it demanded absolute obedience. I pushed my chair back and stood, forcing myself to meet his piercing gaze. "Look around you," he said, gesturing to the sprawling dining room, the high ceilings, the custom artwork on the walls. You bought a $15 million estate in Buckhead with money you earned from your own sweat, your own intellect, and your own grind. You built a premier crisis management firm from a laptop in a cramped studio apartment. You did all of this without asking me or your father for a single dime. You are the only person in this family who actually inherited my business acumen. And you are standing here crying because a group of superficial social climbers decided to eat dry turkey in a rented penthouse instead of celebrating your success." He stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Tears are for people who have no power, Maya. You are a Davenport. You hold more power in your little finger than Julian Sterling will ever hold in his entire fabricated life. Stop waiting for an invitation to a table you already own." His words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the remaining self-pity right out of my chest. He was not here to give me a warm emotional hug. He was not here to wipe my tears and tell me everything would be okay. He was here to remind me exactly who I was. He was holding up a mirror, forcing me to look at the empire I had built and the queen I had become. "You knew," I realized, my eyes widening. "You knew about this house. You knew about my company." "I know everything that happens in this city," he replied, a faint, proud smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I watched you quietly buy out your competitors. I watched you secure those massive corporate contracts. I stayed silent because a true boss moves in silence. You move like a predator, Maya. But right now you are acting like prey. It is time to change that." He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit coat. He did not pull out a gift or a sentimental family heirloom. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. Across the front, the word "confidential" was stamped in bold red ink. He tossed the envelope onto the dining table. It landed right next to the empty plate where my mother was supposed to sit. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that seemed to shift the very gravity in the room. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the brown paper as if it might catch fire. "That," my grandfather said, leaning his weight onto his silver-handled cane, "is the end of their little masquerade." I reached out and hovered my fingers over the envelope. "Your father, Marcus Jr., has been a profound disappointment to me," he continued, his voice laced with a cold, hard truth. "He inherited my wealth, but none of my wisdom. He and your mother are so obsessed with proximity to whiteness, so addicted to the illusion of high society, that they have blindly mortgaged their own souls to keep Julian and Chloe living in luxury. They think I am just an old man losing his grip on the family assets. They think you are just a girl managing internet gossip." He nodded toward the envelope. "Open it." I picked up the thick package. The seal had already been broken. I slid my hand inside and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents, financial spreadsheets, and bank transaction records. The logos on the top of the pages belonged to top-tier federal investigative agencies and forensic accounting firms. I began to read the first page. My eyes scanned the complex legal jargon, but the bold numbers and highlighted sections jumped out at me immediately. I flipped to the second page, then the third. My heart started to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. "The people laughing at you on that shattered phone right now," my grandfather said, his voice dangerously quiet, "are currently digging their own financial graves. Julian is not a financial genius. He is a criminal, and your parents are his biggest victims and his most pathetic enablers. I stared at the paperwork, my mind racing to process the monumental weight of what I was holding. This was not just family gossip. This was a loaded weapon. My grandfather had not come to my house to comfort me over a ruined Thanksgiving dinner. He had come to hand me the exact ammunition I needed to execute a flawless total destruction of the people who had just humiliated me. "You are the crisis manager," Grandpa Marcus said, turning toward the grand foyer. He stopped and looked back at me over his shoulder. "I am giving you the biggest crisis this family has ever seen. The only question is, are you going to manage it, or are you going to exploit it?" I looked down at the documents in my hands. The sadness that had paralyzed me just minutes ago was completely gone. The cold, biting fury returned, but this time it was focused, sharp, and highly weaponized. I looked up at my grandfather, and a slow, lethal smile spread across my face. "I am going to exploit it," I said, my voice steady and absolute. "I am going to burn their entire fake world straight to the ground." Grandpa Marcus nodded once, a look of profound satisfaction settling on his weathered face. "Then put your war paint on, daughter. We have a penthouse to crash." I spread the stack of thick, stapled documents across the polished mahogany of my dining table. The stark black ink contrasted sharply with the pristine white paper demanding my immediate attention. My eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the data with the clinical precision of a seasoned crisis manager. The first file was a comprehensive, highly confidential forensic audit of Sterling Capital Management. This was Julian's supposedly untouchable elite hedge fund, the very foundation of his superior status in my family. I traced my index finger down the columns of numbers. Red ink was everywhere. The financial statements painted a picture of absolute unmitigated disaster. Sterling Capital was not managing billions. It was hemorrhaging cash at a lethal rate. Julian had not closed a massive new investment project like my mother had claimed in her text message. The documents revealed the exact opposite. He was liquidating his remaining toxic assets at pennies on the dollar just to keep the lights on. Julian was running a sophisticated high-end illusion. Client withdrawal requests were piled up in the attached internal emails, met with fabricated excuses about locked liquidity periods and market restructuring. He was taking new money simply to pay off the old investors who were threatening immediate legal action. It was a classic, desperate Ponzi scheme in its final agonizing death throes. Julian Sterling was completely bankrupt. He was millions of dollars in the hole, facing imminent financial slaughter. I flipped to the next section of the dossier, which contained his personal financial records. The luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta where my family was currently gathered to worship him was a mirage. The lease was 3 months past due. There were multiple notices of default tucked between the pages, threatening immediate eviction. The exotic cars the designer watches, the massive diamond ring Chloe practically shoved into the camera lens during her live stream, all of it was financed to the absolute breaking point. Julian was drowning in high-interest debt, borrowing from predatory lenders just to maintain his flashy lifestyle. The realization hit me with a sickening clarity. My parents were sitting in a rented, unpaid penthouse toasting to a man who was nothing more than a well-dressed con artist. They had been so easily blinded by his confident swagger and his proximity to traditional white wealth. Julian had walked into our lives banking on his race and a tailored suit, knowing people would automatically assume he was competent. Meanwhile, I had to build a flawless resume, work 80-hour weeks, and fight for every single inch of respect in corporate boardrooms. My parents bought into the societal lie that his mere presence elevated our family. They recognized his white privilege as a currency they desperately wanted to spend. Julian had recognized my parents' deep-seated insecurity, their clawing need to be accepted by the upper echelons of Atlanta high society. He played them perfectly. He offered them the ultimate status symbol, a successful elite son-in-law, and they fell for it without demanding a single receipt. They sacrificed their own successful, hard-working daughter on the altar of his unearned privilege. And Chloe, my perfect golden child sister, her entire reality was a carefully curated lie. She built her social media brand on being the wealthy, pampered wife of a financial genius. She looked down on me for building my own company, for getting my hands dirty in the trenches of public relations. She believed her position was secure because she married into it. But the paperwork in front of me proved she was married to a ghost. When this house of cards collapsed, Chloe would have absolutely nothing to her name. I continued reading, my mind shifting into full operational mode. In my line of work, I dismantle corporate disasters daily. I know exactly what a fatal crisis looks like before it hits the press. Julian was displaying all the classic symptoms of a cornered fraudster. The extravagant Thanksgiving dinner he was hosting tonight was not a family celebration. It was a desperate, calculated performance. He likely had potential marks at that table, wealthy guests he needed to impress to secure one last influx of cash before the federal regulators came knocking. A flagged email exchange at the back of the packet caught my attention. It was a frantic communication between Julian and his chief financial officer. Julian needed a massive injection of capital by Monday morning. If he did not deposit $2 million into the main fund to cover a specific set of aggressive client withdrawals, the Securities and Exchange Commission would officially freeze his assets. Monday was the hard deadline. Tonight was Thursday. He had less than 96 hours before his entire life ended in federal indictments and prison sentences. I stacked the papers back together, tapping the edges against the table to align them perfectly. The sheer audacity of his deception was breathtaking. He had the nerve to mock me on a public live stream, calling me a failure who bought discount groceries while he was literally hours away from facing federal prison time. He was projecting his own monumental failures onto me to mask the stench of his own rotting empire. But something still did not make sense. If Julian needed $2 million by Monday to stay out of handcuffs, how was he planning to get it? He had maxed out every line of credit. His properties were heavily leveraged. His institutional investors were pulling out. A man like Julian does not host a lavish dinner party unless he thinks he has already secured his lifeline. He had found a mark. Someone gullible enough and wealthy enough to hand him exactly what he needed. I looked over at my grandfather. He was leaning against his cane, watching me process the information with sharp, calculating eyes. He knew exactly what I was thinking. The first truth had been revealed. Julian was a broke, desperate fraud, but the envelope was thick. There was a second file tucked beneath the audit, bound with a heavy red clip. My grandfather nodded toward the remaining documents. I slid the red clip off the second file. As I read the header on the first page, my blood turned to ice. Julian had found his $2 million. And the source of that money made my previous anger feel like a mere spark compared to the raging inferno that just ignited in my chest. The header on the red-clipped document did not just list financial irregularities. It bore the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Below it, in stark capital letters, read the subject line: Wire Fraud Investigation, Title 18, United States Code Section 1343. Julian Sterling was the primary target of an active multi-agency federal probe. I scanned the densely packed paragraphs detailing the exact nature of his crimes, bringing my years of crisis management experience to bear on the text. Julian was not merely a bad investor making poor market predictions. He was a calculated predator. The FBI had meticulously documented his transaction history over the past 8 months. When his legitimate investments began to tank, he did not inform his clients. He did not file for bankruptcy or attempt to restructure his fund. Instead, he set up a labyrinth of shell companies scattered across Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands. He began electronically siphoning capital from new investors directly into his personal holding accounts to maintain his opulent lifestyle. The sheer scale of his wire fraud was staggering. He had diverted millions of dollars across state and international lines, leaving a digital trail of breadcrumbs that federal forensic accountants had easily followed. I traced my finger along a highlighted flowchart, mapping the movement of the stolen funds. The money he used to secure the lease on the Midtown penthouse did not come from his non-existent hedge fund profits. It came from a local teacher's pension fund he had gutted just 6 weeks ago. The massive diamond ring Chloe was flashing on her live stream, the tailored vest Julian wore, while carving the turkey, the vintage champagne my parents were happily drinking. All of it was bought with dirty, stolen money. A wave of profound disgust washed over me. My parents, who had spent their entire lives obsessing over respectability and social standing, were currently sitting in the middle of an active federal crime scene. They were feasting on the stolen life savings of hard-working people. They had traded their dignity to sit at a table funded by wire fraud, completely oblivious to the fact that the man they worshipped was a common thief in a designer suit. Julian had successfully weaponized their blind reverence for white wealth. He knew my parents would never ask to see his ledgers. He knew they would accept his success at face value because he fit the demographic profile they had been conditioned to idolize since birth. I read further into the FBI summary, noting the specific dates of the wiretaps and digital surveillance. Federal agents had been monitoring Julian phone calls and email servers for months. They had compiled a mountain of irrefutable evidence. He was completely trapped. The document explicitly stated that an indictment was imminent. It was only a matter of time before armed federal agents kicked down the doors of that penthouse, seized all the assets, and dragged Julian out in handcuffs. As a public relations executive, my mind immediately began simulating the fallout. The crisis would not just destroy Julian. It would obliterate my family. If the FBI raided the penthouse tonight, my parents would be caught directly in the crossfire. My mother and father, who had so willingly attached their names and reputations to Julian, would be plastered across the evening news as the in-laws of a convicted federal fraudster. Chloe would be stripped of her fake luxury life, her social media accounts seized as evidence, and she would be publicly exposed as the clueless wife of a criminal. The absolute humiliation they would face was beyond comprehension. The very social standing they had sacrificed me to protect was about to be eradicated by the white savior they had chosen over their own daughter. I looked up at my grandfather. He was watching me intently, his hands resting firmly on the silver handle of his cane. He had brought this information to me because he knew exactly what I did for a living. I managed crises. I controlled narratives. He was waiting to see if I would use this information to save our family from the impending federal fallout, or if I would let them burn in the fire they had so eagerly stoked. "They are eating a meal paid for by stolen pensions," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Every single thing in that penthouse is the proceeds of wire fraud. The feds have a complete map of his transactions. He is not just broke grandpa. He is going to federal prison, and he is going to drag Patricia and Marcus Jr. down into the mud right alongside him." My grandfather gave a slow, grim nod. "Julian Sterling is a parasite," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet dining room. "He fed on the desperation of his investors, and then he fed on the vanity of your parents. He built a kingdom of lies, and now the walls are caving in. But a parasite does not die quietly, Maya. When it runs out of blood, it searches for a new host." His words sent a sharp spike of adrenaline through my veins. I looked back down at the documents, focusing on the most recent entries in the federal tracking log. The FBI noted a sudden, massive surge in Julian wire activity within the last 48 hours. A newly established shell company in Delaware had received a frantic influx of capital. Exactly $2 million had been wired into Julian personal control just yesterday afternoon. It was the exact amount he needed to satisfy the Securities and Exchange Commission and temporarily avoid an asset freeze by Monday morning. The FBI log traced the origin of this miraculous $2 million lifeline. Julian had not secured a new corporate investor. He had not found another pension fund to drain. The money had been wired from a private domestic trust account. A trust account tied directly to my family. My hands began to tremble, not from fear but from a rage so pure and concentrated it felt like it might burn straight through my skin. The initial shock of discovering Julian criminal enterprise was entirely eclipsed by the horrifying realization of who he had targeted to save himself. The red, clipped file contained more than just his federal indictment summary. It contained the exact bank routing numbers and authorization signatures that executed that $2 million transfer. I flipped to the final page of the wire fraud report, demanding to see the name attached to the origin account. The paper detailed the transaction down to the exact second the money left the family trust. I stared at the authorization signatures at the bottom of the wire transfer receipt. The letters swam before my eyes before snapping into sharp, devastating focus. I knew those signatures. I had seen them on birthday cards, on report cards, on every document of my childhood. The $2 million did not come from Julian. It did not come from Chloe. It came directly from the people sitting at that dining table, smiling at the camera and toasting to his success. The signatures on the wire transfer authorization form belonged to my parents, Patricia Davenport and Marcus Davenport Jr., signed, stamped, and dated just 24 hours ago. But it was the account number printed at the very top of the receipt that made the breath completely vanish from my lungs. I knew that sequence of numbers. I had memorized it when I was 18 years old. It was the routing number for the irrevocable trust fund my grandfather had established exclusively in my name. The account had been strictly designated for my future, a financial fortress meant to ensure I would never have to depend on anyone. The balance had been exactly $2 million. And now the remaining balance printed at the bottom of the federal document read 0. My parents had not just invested their own money into Julian's sinking ship, they had robbed their own daughter. They had bypassed the banking security protocols, likely exploiting their legacy status as the original custodians of the account before I came of age, and completely drained my trust fund. They had taken my entire safety net and wired it directly into the personal holding account of a federal criminal just to keep their golden son-in-law out of handcuffs for one more weekend. I stared at the black ink of my mother's signature. The sharp, elegant cursive loops seemed to mock me from the page. A visceral, violent memory suddenly ripped through my mind, triggered by the sheer audacity of her handwriting. It was 5 years ago. I was standing in the center of my parents' opulent study wearing a cheap thrift store suit. I was exhausted living off instant noodles and sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a cramped studio apartment. I had spent 3 sleepless weeks compiling a flawless, data-driven business plan for my crisis management firm. I had printed it on high-quality paper, bound it in leather, and presented it to my parents asking for a $50,000 startup loan. Just a fraction of what I needed to secure office space and hire my first employee. I remembered the smell of my father's expensive cigar smoke hanging in the air. He did not even bother to open the leather binder. He just pushed it back across the mahogany desk with the tip of his pen, as if touching it might infect him with failure. Public relations is not a real business, Maya. My father had scoffed, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. It is glorified internet gossip. We are not going to liquidate family assets to fund a pipe dream. You need to stop being so stubborn and get a real job. My mother had been standing by the window swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. She did not even look at me. "Why can you not be more like Julian?" she had sneered, her voice laced with that familiar toxic disappointment. "Julian is managing global assets. He understands macroeconomics. He is building real wealth for Chloe. We are currently shifting our liquid capital into his new emerging markets fund because he actually knows how to generate a return. You should be giving Julian whatever little savings you have to manage instead of throwing it away on this foolishness. Learn your place, Maya. Learn your place." The words echoed in my mind, ringing with a new sickening clarity. They had looked me dead in the eyes, criticized my ambition, and claimed they had no assets to spare. They watched me walk out of their house completely defeated. They watched me grind through 80-hour work weeks, sacrificing my sleep, my health, and my youth to build my company from absolute scratch. They watched me bleed for my success, and all the while they were secretly plotting to funnel the $2 million my grandfather had gifted me straight into Julian's fraudulent empire. They did not just refuse to help me, they actively sabotaged my future to subsidize Chloe's fake luxury lifestyle. They stole my inheritance to buy Julian tailored vests, his flashy sports cars, and the very penthouse they were currently sitting in. Every single time my mother had looked down her nose at me and praised Julian financial genius, she was covering up the greatest theft this family had ever seen. She was mocking the victim of her own grand larceny. A cold, terrifying calm washed over me. The shock evaporated, leaving behind a profound crystalline focus. I was no longer a hurt daughter looking for validation. I was a CEO whose primary asset had just been embezzled by a hostile entity. I looked up at my grandfather. He was watching the transformation happen across my face. He saw the exact moment the grieving daughter died and the ruthless businesswoman took over. They used a forged power of attorney. Grandpa Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. They manipulated a loophole in the custodial handover protocol. My forensic accountants caught the discrepancy late last night, but the wire had already cleared the Federal Reserve. They drained your blood to feed a parasite Maya. They thought because you never checked the balance, because you were too proud and too determined to make it on your own, that you would never notice the money was gone. He took a step closer, his dark eyes burning with an intense, fierce pride. They thought you were weak. They thought you were just the scapegoat, the quiet middle child who would just take the beating and stay in the shadows. They deeply underestimated you, and they severely underestimated me. I placed my hands flat on the dining table, leaning my weight over the scattered documents. The FBI indictment, the bank records, the forged wire transfers. It was a complete, undeniable arsenal. Julian needs this $2 million to clear a margin call by Monday morning, I said, my voice steady, stripped of all emotion. But the money is currently sitting in a holding account flagged by the Department of Justice. The FBI is watching that specific account. If Julian tries to move that stolen $2 million to pay off his angry investors, he triggers an automatic federal freeze. Exactly, Grandpa Marcus said, a slow, lethal smile spreading across his face. The money they stole from you is radioactive. Julian cannot use it without immediately alerting the feds to his exact location and his corporate aliases. Your parents threw your $2 million directly into a federal black hole. The money is gone, and Julian is still going to burn. The beautiful poetic justice of the situation was almost intoxicating. My parents had committed a massive felony to save a man who was already a dead man walking. They had tied themselves to a sinking anchor, and the best part was, they had absolutely no idea. They were currently sitting in that penthouse drinking vintage champagne, completely convinced they had gotten away with the perfect crime. They believed they had secured Chloe's future and solidified their own status in Atlanta high society. They do not know about the FBI investigation, I stated, looking at my grandfather for confirmation. They think Julian is actually a hedge fund genius. They think they just made a brilliant, covert investment. They are completely blind, he confirmed. Julian has kept them entirely in the dark. He just told them he needed a temporary influx of capital to clear a lucrative international hurdle. He promised them a massive return. They handed over your trust fund like obedient little subjects bringing tribute to a king. I reached out and gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the table until they formed a perfect, seamless stack. I slid the paperwork back into the heavy manila envelope and wrapped the red string around the closure. The weight of the envelope in my hands felt like absolute power. My parents had spent 32 years treating me like a liability. They had weaponized my independence against me. They had stolen my grandfather's legacy and handed it to a white con artist just to maintain the illusion of black excellence. They thought they held all the cards. They thought they controlled the narrative. But I was the one holding the federal indictment. I was the one holding the wire fraud receipts. I was the one who owned the crisis. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room. It was 8:15 in the evening. The Thanksgiving dinner in that midtown penthouse would be in full swing. Julian would be holding court, basking in the adoration of my parents, playing the role of the generous, wealthy provider. I turned to my grandfather. His silver-handled cane gleamed in the ambient light of the chandelier. He was ready. He had been ready since the moment he walked through my front doors. "We are not just going to crash their dinner party," I said, my voice echoing with icy, calculated precision. "We are going to execute a hostile takeover. I want every single guest in that penthouse to see exactly who Julian Sterling really is. I want my parents to look me in the eye when I tell them they are going to federal prison for wire fraud." Grandpa Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit. He looked at me, his chest swelling with undeniable pride. "That is the Davenport spirit," he said, turning toward the grand foyer. I grabbed my designer coat from the chair and picked up the manila envelope. I did not look back at the $15,000 feast sitting cold on my dining table. That meal belonged to the past. It belonged to the girl who used to beg for their love. The woman walking out the door was only hungry for one thing: absolute destruction. The lobby attendant scrambled out from behind the mahogany reception desk the moment we walked through the glass revolving doors. He raised a hand, opening his mouth to ask for our names, but the words died in his throat as his eyes locked onto my grandfather. "You do not ask Marcus Davenport Sr. for an invitation in this city. You simply get out of his way." The attendant swallowed hard, stepped back, and quickly swiped a master keycard against the private elevator panel. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing us inside the quiet, mirrored cab. As we ascended to the penthouse level, the digital floor indicator ticked upward, counting down the seconds until Julian fabricated world collided with brutal reality. I stood perfectly still, my breathing slow and measured. I looked at the manila envelope in my hands. It was the only weapon I needed. The elevator chimed softly. The heavy steel doors glided apart, opening directly into the grand foyer of Julian leased penthouse. The sensory assault was immediate. A live jazz trio was playing a smooth, upbeat tune in the corner of the expansive open-concept living room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered food, imported perfumes, and the sharp, unmistakable aroma of desperate networking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, serving as a glittering backdrop for Julian's latest performance. The room was packed with people who clearly did not belong at a genuine family Thanksgiving dinner. These were not relatives or close friends. They were targets. I recognized a prominent local real estate developer, two junior partners from a major corporate law firm, and an older woman who sat on the board of a regional hospital network. Julian had surrounded himself with high-net-worth individuals playing the gracious host while actively sizing up their wallets. He was hunting for the $2 million he needed to save himself from federal prison. He stood near the center of the room holding court. He had taken off his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt to project a false image of relaxed confidence. He held a glass of dark amber liquor in one hand, gesturing expansively with the other, as he spun a web of lies to a captivated group of investors. "And the emerging market sector is entirely about timing," Julian was saying, his voice booming with unearned authority. "You have to recognize the undervalued assets before the institutional money catches on. That is exactly how Sterling Capital delivered a 40% return last quarter. We do not follow the market. We dictate it." I felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me. He was standing there pitching double-digit returns to people while actively facing a federal wire fraud indictment. He was a sociopath in a tailored shirt. A few feet away, Chloe was playing her part to perfection. She drifted between groups of guests, balancing a plate of artisanal appetizers and a flute of champagne. She tossed her head back, laughing a little too loudly at a joke made by a wealthy socialite. Her massive diamond ring caught the light from the modern fixtures above, flashing brilliantly. She looked like the ultimate trophy wife, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire existence was funded by stolen pensions and my hijacked trust fund. My parents were positioned near the panoramic windows, clinging to the edges of Julian's spotlight. My mother, Patricia, wore an emerald green gown that screamed new money. She was nodding enthusiastically at everything Julian said, her face glowing with a toxic mixture of pride and validation. My father stood beside her, his chest puffed out, holding a crystal tumbler and trying desperately to look like a man who belonged in this echelon of society. They had sold my future to buy their tickets to this exact room. My grandfather and I stepped out of the elevator and onto the pristine white rug of the foyer. We did not announce ourselves. We did not need to. The heavy rhythmic thud of my grandfather's silver-handled cane striking the hardwood floor cut through the smooth jazz music like a metronome of impending doom. Thud, step, thud, step. The sound was sharp, heavy, and completely out of place in the sleek modern penthouse. One by one, the guests nearest to the foyer turned around to see the source of the noise. Their polite networking smiles instantly vanished. When you operate in the upper tiers of Atlanta business, you know who Marcus Davenport Sr. is. You recognize the face of a man who built neighborhoods, who shattered redlining barriers, and who commanded absolute respect in every bank in the state. The guests who recognized him immediately took a step back, parting like the Red Sea to give him a clear path. Then their eyes shifted to me. I walked right beside him, my midnight blue trench coat tied sharply at my waist, my posture radiating lethal intent. I did not look like the invisible, disappointing middle child. I looked like the person who owned the building. The ripple effect was instantaneous. The conversation in the immediate vicinity died abruptly. The sudden drop in volume caused the people further into the room to turn around. Within 10 seconds, the lively, bustling dinner party fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. The only sounds left in the sprawling penthouse were the upbeat bass line of the jazz trio, who had not yet realized they were playing at a funeral, and the relentless thud of my grandfather Kane. Julian was mid-sentence, promising another fabricated return on investment to the hospital board member, when he noticed his audience looking past him. He turned around, his confident smile still plastered across his face. The moment his eyes locked onto me, the smile shattered. It did not just fade, it broke completely. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic hedge fund manager disappeared, and the desperate, cornered criminal underneath was fully exposed. His hand tightened around his glass so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Chloe was the next to see us. She had just taken a sip of champagne. She lowered the glass slowly, her eyes wide with shock. She blinked rapidly as if trying to clear a hallucination. The sight of me standing there side by side with the patriarch of the Davenport family completely short-circuited her brain. Then my parents saw us. My mother's emerald green gown seemed to lose its luster. She took a literal step backward, bumping into the glass window behind her. Her mouth fell slightly open. My father lowered his crystal tumbler, his chest deflating as the reality of our presence hit him. We stood in the dead center of the living room, surrounded by dozens of frozen guests. The jazz bassist finally stopped playing, creating a silence so thick it felt physically heavy. Every single eye in the penthouse was fixed on us, waiting for the explosion. I did not break eye contact with Julian. I let him stew in the agonizing silence. I let him feel the terror of knowing the people he had cast out had just walked through his front door with a loaded weapon. I held the thick manila envelope loosely at my side, letting the red confidential stamp face outward for him to see. The execution block was prepared, the audience was captive. The trial was about to begin. Chloe's heels broke the heavy silence of the room. Clack, clack, clack. She handed her half-empty champagne flute to a passing, thoroughly bewildered waiter and marched across the pristine white rug. Her face went through a rapid, frantic series of micro-expressions before settling firmly on a mask of condescending pity. This was her ultimate survival mechanism. Whenever threatened, Chloe relied on performative public humiliation to disarm her opponents and elevate herself. "Maya, what on earth are you doing here?" Chloe asked. Her voice was pitched perfectly loud enough for the hospital board member and the real estate developer standing nearby to hear every single syllable. She sounded exactly like a wealthy, inconvenienced patron scolding a trespassing beggar. Julian specifically told building security that tonight was an exclusive invite-only event for our corporate investors. You cannot just crash a private networking dinner because you feel left out of the family holidays. I did not blink, I did not shift my weight, I just watched her perform her desperate little play. Chloe turned her attention to my grandfather, her harsh tone instantly dissolving into a sickeningly sweet coo. She reached out to touch his arm, playing the role of the devoted high society granddaughter. "Grandpa Marcus, we are so thrilled you decided to come after all. But why did you let Maya drag you up here like this? We have a reserved seat for you right next to Julian at the head table. Let Marcus Jr. take your coat and we can have security escort Maya back down to the lobby. She is clearly having one of her emotional episodes again." Grandpa Marcus did not move a single muscle. He simply looked down at Chloe's manicured hand resting on his tailored wool sleeve. He looked at her fingers with the exact same level of disgust one might reserve for a disease-carrying insect. Chloe quickly pulled her hand back, her fake camera-ready smile faltering for a fraction of a second as the rejection burned her. When my grandfather absolutely refused to engage with her performance, Chloe pivoted all of her venom back to me. She crossed her arms over her chest, ensuring the massive diamond on her left hand caught the ambient light of the chandelier. She was trying to build a fortress of wealth between us, using carrots and designer labels to shield her deep-seated insecurities. Seriously, Maya, this is beyond pathetic, Chloe hissed, stepping closer so her voice would not carry as far, though the sheer malice in her tone was palpable to anyone in the room. You threw a temper tantrum because we did not want to eat dry turkey in whatever cramped little house you are renting these days, so you decided to embarrass us in front of Julian colleagues. Do you have any idea how much money is in this room right now? These people are managing global portfolios. They are the elite of Atlanta. They do not have time to deal with a bitter, jealous public relations girl who spends her days cleaning up internet gossip for cheap influencers. I looked at her. I took a slow, deliberate inventory of my sister. I looked at the way her designer gown fit perfectly bought and paid for by stolen pension funds. I looked at the least modern art hanging on the walls. Then I looked past her shoulder at Julian. He had not moved an inch from where he stood. The nervous sweat was starting to bead visibly on his forehead. He was terrified, paralyzed by the sight of the manila envelope in my hand. "Are you quite finished, Chloe?" I asked. My voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was the same voice I used when negotiating hostile corporate buyouts, cold, clinical, and absolutely lethal. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless laugh, glancing back at her guests to ensure they were witnessing her handle the situation with superior grace. "I am just getting started. You have always been obsessed with competing with me, but this is a new low. Julian is building a financial empire. He is providing a standard of living you could not even dream of. You are standing in a $10 million penthouse, Maya. Look around. You do not belong here. You have never belonged in our world. Now take your little paper envelope, turn around, and go back to your discount grocery stores and your lonely little life before I have Julian call the police for trespassing." She felt so incredibly powerful. She believed her proximity to Julian white privilege made her bulletproof. She thought she was the apex predator in the room simply because she held a glass of champagne in a high rise. She had absolutely no idea that she was standing on a trap door, and my hand was resting firmly on the lever. "You talk a lot about Julian wealth," I said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. The physical gap between us closed. I towered over her, my posture rigidly straight, my trench coat wrapping me in midnight blue armor. "You talk about his empire. You flash that ring like it is a shield that can protect you from reality. But you do not actually know anything about the numbers, do you, Chloe? You never ask to see the ledgers. You just spend the money, post the pictures, and ask no questions." Chloe frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her carefully contoured face. "What are you talking about? Julian is a financial genius. Everyone in this room knows it. He manages billions." "Julian is a panicked, cornered animal," I corrected, keeping my voice low, ensuring only she and the immediate circle could hear the absolute certainty in my tone. "And this entire party is a slaughterhouse. You are standing here insulting my career, mocking my lifestyle, and threatening to call the police on me. I highly suggest you do call them, Chloe. In fact, why do you not bypass the local police and call the federal authorities directly? I am sure the FBI would love to skip the line and come up here right now." Chloe stepped back, her bravado cracking right down the middle. The specific mention of the FBI was not something she could easily brush off as a jealous sister rant. She whipped her head around to look at Julian. She expected him to march over, put a protective arm around her waist, and throw me out of the building. She expected him to defend their kingdom. But Julian was staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. He was not coming to her defense. He was not stepping in to save her. He was hyperventilating. "You are crazy," Chloe whispered, but her voice shook noticeably. "You are just trying to ruin my night because you are miserable and alone." "I am not trying to ruin your night," I replied, raising the heavy manila envelope just slightly, letting the red confidential stamp catch her eye. "I am bringing you the check for it. You have been living on borrowed time and stolen money, and the bill is officially past due. You wanted to know what I do for a living. I manage crises that destroy companies. But tonight I am not here to manage a crisis. I am here to deliver a fatal one. Chloe opened her mouth to scream for security, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. The illusion of her perfect black excellence lifestyle was fracturing into a million jagged pieces. The wealthy guests were murmuring to each other, exchanging nervous, calculating glances as they watched the mighty Sterling Empire begin to show highly visible, catastrophic cracks. The elite smell blood in the water faster than anyone else, and the water in this penthouse had just turned crimson. But before Chloe could utter another word or call for the guards, the sound of hurried, panicked footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The cavalry was rushing in to protect their golden child from the monster they had created. Maya, what in God's name is wrong with you? My mother's voice sliced through the tension like a shattered glass. Patricia Davenport pushed her way past a group of startled real estate developers, her emerald green gown rustling violently. My father, Marcus Jr., was right on her heels. His jaw was clenched so tight, the veins in his neck were pulsing. They did not look at my grandfather first. They did not even acknowledge the patriarch of our family standing right beside me. Their eyes were locked entirely on me, blazing with a toxic, familiar rage. For 32 years, I had shrunk under that exact look. It was the look that told me I was out of line, that I was taking up too much space, that I was embarrassing the Davenport name simply by existing outside of their strict, impossible parameters. But tonight, that look held absolutely zero power over me. Patricia grabbed my upper arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into the wool sleeve of my trench coat. "You are leaving right now," she hissed, lowering her voice to a harsh, desperate whisper so the guests would not hear. "You malicious, jealous girl. Julian is hosting a critical networking event. There are people in this room who manage state funds. How dare you walk in here looking for a handout and cause a scene?" I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until the sheer freezing weight of my gaze forced her to let go. She pulled her hand back as if the fabric of my coat had suddenly caught fire. "I am not looking for a handout, Patricia," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz music that was still trying and failing to keep the atmosphere light. "I do not need handouts. I am the one who has been secretly paying off your mortgage for the last 3 years." My father stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He positioned himself between me and the crowd of investors attempting to physically block their view of the confrontation. "Stop lying," he ordered, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You have always been a compulsive liar, Maya. You could not stand the fact that Julian is a real success. You could not stand that Chloe married a man of actual substance while you peddle internet rumors for a living. Julian is securing this family's financial legacy. You are just a bitter child trying to tear down what you could never build." "Securing your financial legacy," I repeated. A sharp, genuinely amused laugh escaped my lips. "Is that what he told you yesterday afternoon when he begged you to empty my trust fund?" The entire room seemed to stop breathing. The silence became an absolute vacuum. My mother's eyes widened to the size of saucers. All the color instantly vanished from her carefully powdered face. My father's hand, the one he had been pointing at me, dropped to his side like a lead weight. They froze, completely paralyzed by the realization that their darkest, most desperate secret had just been dragged into the blinding light. "I know everything," I said, my tone shifting from amused to utterly ruthless. "I know about the irrevocable trust fund Grandpa Marcus set up for me. I know it sat untouched, gathering interest, holding exactly $2 million. And I know that at 2:14 yesterday afternoon, you two used an outdated custodial loophole to bypass the bank's security protocols and wire every single cent of my money directly into Julian's personal holding account." "Keep your voice down," my father pleaded, his arrogant facade completely disintegrating. He glanced frantically over his shoulder at the hospital board member and the law firm partners who were now watching us with horrified fascination. "Maya, please, you do not understand macroeconomics." Julian found a closed-door, high-yield investment vehicle. Your money was just sitting there doing nothing. He is going to triple it by the end of the quarter. We did it for the good of the whole family. You did not make an investment. Grandpa Marcus finally spoke, his voice booming with the authority of a judge handing down a death sentence. He stepped forward, raising his silver-handled cane and pointing it directly at his son's chest. You committed grand larceny. You robbed your own flesh and blood to feed a parasite. Dad? My father stammered, shrinking back under his father's furious gaze. Julian is a genius. You just have not seen his portfolio. We are expanding our wealth. Julian is a federal criminal, I stated loudly. I raised the manila envelope, making sure every single VIP guest in the penthouse could see the red, bold letters stamped across the front. There is no high-yield investment vehicle. There is no global portfolio. Your precious, brilliant son-in-law is currently the primary target of an active FBI wire fraud investigation. My mother gasped, pressing both hands over her mouth. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless sob, backing away from Julian as if he were suddenly radioactive. Julian's hedge fund has been bankrupt for 6 months. I continued, projecting my voice so it bounced off the floor to ceiling glass windows. He has been running a Ponzi scheme, paying off his old investors with the life savings of local teachers and firefighters. The feds have a complete map of his transactions. The only reason he is not in handcuffs right now is because he needed exactly $2 million to satisfy a Securities and Exchange Commission margin call by Monday morning. He did not secure your legacy, Mother. He used you as a human shield. That is a lie, my mother shrieked, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over her eyelashes. She turned to Julian, grasping for any lifeline. Julian, tell her it is a lie. Tell them you have the money. But Julian said nothing. He was backed against the custom wet bar, staring at the floor, sweating profusely. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. He cannot tell you he has the money, I said, stepping closer to my parents, because the money is already gone. You wired my $2 million into a holding account that was flagged by the Department of Justice 3 weeks ago. The moment that cash hit his ledger, the federal government locked it down. You did not save him. You just handed the FBI a bright neon sign pointing directly to your own bank accounts. No, my father choked out, grabbing the edge of a nearby table to keep himself from collapsing. No, we signed paperwork. We signed a promissory note. Julian said it was totally legal. You signed a confession to aiding and abetting a federal fugitive. Grandpa Marcus corrected him mercilessly. You let your obsession with white validation blind you to basic financial due diligence. You looked at a tailored suit and a smooth smile and decided to hand over your daughter's birthright. You deserve every ounce of the ruin that is coming for you. The guests had heard enough. The word FBI is the ultimate party killer in high society. The real estate developer was already putting on his coat speed, walking toward the elevator without saying a word. The law firm partners were frantically texting on their phones, likely contacting their own crisis management teams to distance themselves from Sterling Capital. The grand, opulent Thanksgiving dinner was dissolving into a panicked evacuation. I watched my parents realize that their social standing, their wealth, and their entire fabricated reality were completely gone. They were not just broke. They were facing criminal complicity. They had sacrificed the daughter who truly loved them to protect a man who had viewed them as nothing more than a convenient ATM. Maya, please, my mother wept, reaching out for my hand again, her voice cracking with a sudden, desperate realization of my power. We are your parents. We made a terrible mistake. You have to help us. You run a crisis firm. You can fix this. You can explain to the authorities that we did not know. I looked down at her outstretched hand. I thought about the $15,000 dinner sitting cold and untouched on my dining table. I thought about the live stream where she laughed at my expense. I did not take her hand. I stepped back, adjusting the belt of my midnight blue trench coat. I am a crisis manager, I said softly, my voice completely drained of any remaining sympathy. But I only work for clients who can afford my retainer. And as of yesterday afternoon, you are completely bankrupt. The echo of my words hung in the cavernous penthouse. My parents looked utterly destroyed, physically shrinking against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. But Julian, who had been sweating profusely against the wet bar just moments ago, suddenly pushed himself forward. His survival instinct was kicking in. For a man like Julian, survival meant defaulting to pure, unfiltered arrogance. He had coasted through his entire life on the assumption that his confident tone and his demographic profile would shield him from any real scrutiny. He decided to double down on his presumed superiority. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that sounded completely jarring and out of place in the devastated room. He rolled down his sleeves, carefully buttoned his expensive cuffs, and stepped into the center of the living room. He acted as if he had just watched a moderately entertaining but ultimately pathetic street performance. "Bravo, Maya," Julian said, clapping his hands together in a slow, sarcastic rhythm. "That was quite the monologue. Did you write that yourself, or did you have one of your little social media interns draft it for you?" He walked toward me, using his height to try and establish a false sense of physical dominance. He looked down his nose at me, his blue eyes hard and dismissive. "You almost had them convinced. But let us look at the actual reality here. You are a public relations girl. You spin Twitter gossip for C-list celebrities who do not know how to shut their mouths online. You have absolutely no concept of how institutional capital works." He gestured expansively around the room, making sure the few remaining guests and my parents were listening. "The federal government is not investigating me. I am restructuring high-yield offshore assets. The banking alerts you are talking about are standard compliance holds for international wires of that magnitude. It is high-level financial protocol. Something a glorified event planner could never understand." Hearing Julian speak with such unwavering conviction, Chloe immediately grasped at the lifeline. Her tears stopped instantly, and she straightened her spine, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. "See?" she hissed, glaring at me from behind Julian's shoulder. "I knew it. You are just making things up because you are jealous. You have always tried to ruin everything I have. You could not stand sitting alone on Thanksgiving, so you came here to throw a tantrum and embarrass us." Julian placed a protective, possessive hand on Chloe's arm, playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy protector. "Your parents made a calculated, sophisticated investment tonight," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "They wired that money to me because they finally realized that traditional conservative wealth building is a dying art. They wanted a piece of the real market. I gave them exclusive access to a closed-door fund. I did them a massive favor." He looked at my grandfather, then back at me, his gaze heavy with white supremacist arrogance. "You think because your grandfather built some local real estate a few decades ago that you understand global finance. You are playing in a sandbox, Maya. I operate on Wall Street. I sit in rooms you could not even buy a ticket to enter. Your little PR stunt tonight is nothing more than a pathetic, hysterical outburst from a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand seeing her sister win." I did not move. I did not flinch. I just watched him. I watched the absolute staggering delusion of a man who believed his privilege made him immortal. He was standing on a live landmine, daring me to press the detonator. His arrogance was so blinding that he could not even recognize the executioner standing right in front of him. "We are done here," Julian stated, pulling his sleek smartphone from his tailored trousers. "I was going to let you stay for a drink out of pity, but you have officially exhausted my patience. You are disturbing my guests and trespassing on private property." He tapped the screen, dialing the building high-security concierge desk. He held the phone to his ear, ensuring his voice carried across the silent room. "Yes, this is Julian Sterling in the penthouse. I need your executive security team up here immediately. I have 2 unauthorized individuals refusing to leave the premises. Yes, have the local police on standby if they resist." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He crossed his arms over his chest, rocking back on his heels with a smug, victorious smirk. "You have exactly 2 minutes before armed guards drag you and your grandfather out of my home. If you ever try to slander my firm again, I will bury your little crisis agency in so much litigation you will be answering phones at a customer service call center for the rest of your life. Get out of my penthouse." My parents looked tentatively hopeful. They wanted so desperately to believe him. They wanted to believe that Julian's arrogant dismissal was the truth, and my documents were just a jealous lie. They needed Julian to be the savior they had paid $2 million to secure. I stood completely still, letting his threats echo off the expensive modern art hanging on the walls. The more he talked, the deeper he dug his own grave. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully bullied the black woman back into her place by raising his voice and threatening legal action. He thought his confidence alone could rewrite reality. He had no idea that I was just letting him climb to the very highest peak of his ego so the fall would shatter every single bone in his fabricated life. I looked at him, my expression perfectly neutral. I reached into the pocket of my midnight blue trench coat. I did not pull out my phone to argue. I did not raise my voice to match his. I simply pulled out a crisp folded piece of thick watermarked paper. I took my time unfolding the crisp, thick watermarked paper. I smoothed out the sharp creases with deliberate, agonizing slowness, letting the agonizing silence stretch across the living room. Julian stood there, his chest heaving slightly from his arrogant speech, waiting for me to produce a threat he could easily swat away. He expected a personal lawsuit. He expected a cease and desist letter. He expected emotion. I gave him corporate execution. I stepped forward and dropped the document onto the center of the glass coffee table. The heavy parchment landed with a soft, definitive slide. "You are right about one thing, Julian," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the breathless room. "I am a crisis manager, and my firm does not work for cheap influencers or C-list celebrities. We work for institutional entities facing catastrophic extinction events. We control the damage. We cut out the cancer so the host can survive." Julian glanced down at the paper. I saw the exact moment his eyes registered the embossed logo at the top of the page. It was the crest of Sterling Capital Management, his own firm. "Pick it up, Julian," I commanded. My tone was not a request. It was an absolute directive. He hesitated, his previous bravado suddenly fracturing. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the document. His eyes darted across the bold legal text. "That is a fully executed retainer and crisis management agreement," I stated, ensuring my parents, Chloe, and the remaining guests heard every single word. It was signed and countersigned at 8 o'clock this morning. "But the client listed on that contract is not you, Julian. The client is the board of directors of Sterling Capital Management." Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He stared at the signatures at the bottom of the page as if they were written in blood. "They did not sign this," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. The authoritative boom he possessed just 2 minutes ago was entirely gone. "Richard and Sarah would never go behind my back. I am the chief executive officer. I founded this fund. They report to me." "You are the chief executive officer," I corrected him mercilessly. Past tense. "Richard Vance, your chief operating officer, and Sarah Jenkins, your head of compliance, held an emergency executive board session at midnight last night. They did not invite you because you were the subject of the meeting. They discovered the exact same federal wiretaps and offshore shell companies that my forensic accountants found. They realized you have been siphoning client funds to pay for this penthouse, your exotic cars, and Chloe diamond ring." I took another step closer, forcing him to look away from the document and directly into my eyes. "They know you are a fraud, Julian. They know the FBI is preparing to raid the corporate headquarters by Monday morning. And because they are actual financial professionals who want to avoid federal prison, they invoked the moral turpitude clause in your operating agreement. They voted unanimously to terminate you for cause effective immediately. You do not own Sterling Capital Management anymore. You do not even have building access. Your keycard was deactivated 4 hours ago." Chloe let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She grabbed Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive tailored shirt. "Julian, what is she talking about? Tell her she is lying. Tell them you are still the CEO. Look at the paper. What does it say?" Julian could not answer her. He was hyperventilating, his eyes locked on the signatures of his most trusted partners, who had just served him to the wolves on a silver platter. "I will tell you what it says, Chloe," I offered, keeping my gaze locked on the crumbling shell of a man before me. "It says that the board of directors authorized a $500,000 retainer to hire my company, Davenport Crisis Management. They hired me to clean up the monumental radioactive mess your husband created." I turned to address my parents, who were standing frozen against the glass windows, looking as if they had just witnessed a murder. My specific mandate from the board is to draft the official press release announcing Julian immediate termination. I explained, my voice sharp and clinical. My agency is currently coordinating directly with the Department of Justice to ensure the board is viewed as cooperating witnesses rather than co-conspirators. We are controlling the narrative. We are painting Julian as a rogue, isolated criminal who deceived his own partners. The board is throwing him completely under the bus, and they paid me $500,000 of legitimate corporate funds to drive it. Julian staggered backward, hitting the edge of the wet bar. The glass in his hand slipped from his grip, shattering against the hardwood floor. The expensive liquor splashed across his polished leather shoes, but he did not even flinch. His entire reality was collapsing in real time. "This is impossible!" Julian gasped, grasping the edge of the counter to keep himself upright. "I am the face of the company. They need me. They cannot survive the client panic without me. I am the one who brings in the capital." "You do not bring in capital, Julian. You steal it," I fired back, stripping away his last shred of delusion. "And you are no longer the face of the company. You are a liability that is currently being liquidated. You thought you were the smartest person in every room you walked into. You thought you could charm your way through federal financial crimes because you wear a tailored suit and have the right complexion. You looked down on my career because I clean up messes. But you failed to realize that when a mess gets big enough, the person holding the mop holds all the power." My grandfather chuckled, a low, dark sound that vibrated with immense satisfaction. He leaned forward on his cane, addressing my parents directly. "Do you see the difference now, Marcus?" my grandfather asked his son, his voice dripping with righteous judgment. "You and Patricia drained your daughter trust fund, committed a federal felony, and handed $2 million to a sinking criminal just so you could feel like you belonged in high society. Meanwhile, the actual high society, the real corporate board of directors, just paid your daughter $500,000 in clean legal money to put a bullet in his career. They recognized her value, you ignored it, and now you get to burn with him." My father looked at the watermarked contract resting on the glass table. He looked at Julian, who was shaking, unable to form a coherent sentence. Then my father looked at me. For the very first time in my 32 years of life, the look he gave me was not disappointment. It was absolute, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that the daughter he had treated like a peasant had been holding the crown the entire time. "What about the $2 million?" my mother cried out, her voice cracking into a hysterical shriek. "Julian, the money we wired you yesterday. You promised it would secure your position. You promised it would clear the hurdle." Julian slowly turned his head to look at my mother. His eyes were hollow, devoid of the charming sparkle he had weaponized against her for years. "He cannot give it back to you, Patricia," I said, answering for him. "I told you that holding account is monitored by the FBI. If he touches that money, he goes to jail tonight instead of Monday. He took your money knowing it was a lost cause. He let you steal from me because he is a parasite who will drain anyone dry just to buy himself a few more hours of fake luxury." The security guards Julian had called earlier finally stepped out of the private elevator and into the foyer. There were 3 of them, large men in tactical suits. They scanned the room, taking in the shattered glass on the floor, the crying women, and Julian leaning weakly against the bar. "Mr. Sterling," the lead guard said, stepping forward, "we received a call about unauthorized individuals on the premises. Do you need us to escort someone out?" Julian opened his mouth to order them to grab me. He raised a shaking finger in my direction, but his voice failed him. He looked at the crisis management contract on the table. He looked at the cold, predatory calculation in my eyes. He realized that if he escalated this to the authorities right now, I would simply hand the responding officers the federal indictment file resting in my manila envelope. I turned to the lead security guard and offered a polite, professional smile. "There has been a slight misunderstanding, gentlemen," I said, taking total command of the room. "Mr. Sterling is experiencing a severe personal crisis and is no longer in a position to give orders regarding this property. In fact, you should probably stand by. I believe the authorities will be arriving shortly, but it will not be for trespassing. The guards exchanged confused glances, but the absolute authority in my voice kept them firmly planted in the foyer. They could read the power dynamic shifting. They recognized that the man leaning against the bar was no longer the master of the house. I turned my attention back to Julian, preparing to deliver the final crushing sequence of my strategy. The board had fired him, his reputation was dead, but the legal hammer had not even begun to swing. I reached into the heavy manila envelope one last time. The thick textured paper of the final document scraped against the rough edges of the folder as I pulled it free. This was not a corporate contract or a bank ledger. It was a formal, multi-page legal document topped with the unmistakable imposing seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I held it up, letting the harsh light of the chandelier catch the federal insignia. "This is a courtesy copy of the sealed federal indictment," I announced, pivoting my body so that the remaining VIP guests could see exactly what I was holding. The real estate developer, the hospital board member, and the law firm partners had been hovering near the edges of the room, paralyzed by the sheer shock of the unfolding drama. Now their eyes were glued to the document in my hand, their expressions shifting from morbid curiosity to absolute self-preserving terror. My firm was provided this copy under a strict non-disclosure agreement with the Department of Justice. I explained, my voice echoing with terrifying authority. "We need to prepare the corporate narrative for the moment this goes public. The federal magistrate signed off on these warrants yesterday afternoon. Julian Sterling is not just being fired. He is being indicted on 34 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering." Julian let out a pathetic, strangled sound. He reached out blindly, his hand grasping at the empty air, as if he could physically pull the words back into my mouth. I turned my attention directly to the VIP guests. They were the very people Julian had invited here to swindle the marks he needed to secure his desperate $2 million lifeline. I looked at the older woman who sat on the regional hospital board. Her designer dress suddenly looked incredibly heavy on her frame. "I believe your name is Eleanor," I said, addressing her with cold, professional courtesy. "You manage the pension allocations for thousands of nurses and medical staff across the state. Julian invited you here tonight to pitch you on his emerging markets fund. I highly suggest you call your compliance officers right now and ensure Sterling Capital does not have access to a single cent of your hospital treasury. Because the money he took from the Municipal Teachers Union last month is gone. He transferred it to a shell company in the Cayman Islands to pay off his luxury car leases and the overdue rent on this exact penthouse." Eleanor's face drained of all color. She looked at Julian, her expression transforming from polite interest into pure, unadulterated disgust. She set her champagne flute down on a nearby side table with a sharp, resonant clink. "You son of a bitch!" Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "You sat in my office last Tuesday and looked me dead in the eye while you pitched me that garbage. You were trying to steal the retirement funds of my nurses." Julian shook his head frantically. The arrogant, untouchable white savior my parents had worshipped was completely gone. In his place stood a sweaty, cornered fraudster stripping away his own dignity in a desperate bid for survival. "Eleanor, no!" Julian stammered, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Please, you have to listen to me. This is a massive misunderstanding. The funds are secure. I am just restructuring the liquidity pools to maximize your returns. You know the market is volatile right now. I just need a bridge loan to cover the gap. If you just authorize the initial transfer, I can guarantee a 30% return by December." "Do not take another step toward me," Eleanor commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. She grabbed her designer clutch from a nearby chair. "I am going to call the federal authorities myself the second I get into my car." She did not wait for a response. She turned on her heel and marched straight toward the foyer, pushing past the confused security guards without a second glance. Her departure was the catalyst that broke the dam. The real estate developer, a tall man who had been sipping scotch and laughing at Julian jokes just 20 minutes ago, immediately followed suit. "Wait, David," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking as he lunged toward the developer. David, the waterfront commercial project is still viable. I have the zoning permits. We can still make the deal happen. I just need you to front the capital for the environmental survey. You cannot back out now. David stopped and looked Julian up and down, sneering as if he had just stepped in something vile. There is no waterfront project, Julian. You are a walking federal crime scene. If I stay in this room for one more minute, my entire firm gets subpoenaed by association. Do not ever contact my office again. David bypassed Julian, completely striding toward the elevator bank. The junior law firm partners were already scrambling behind him, whispering frantically into their cell phones as they desperately tried to distance their firm from Sterling Capital. The networking event had officially transformed into a mass evacuation. Nobody wants to be the last person standing on a sinking ship, especially when the captain is already wearing digital handcuffs. Julian chased after them, his polished leather shoes slipping on the spilled liquor he had dropped earlier. He grabbed the sleeve of one of the lawyers, his face contorted in absolute panic. "You guys represent me," Julian begged, his voice high and thin. "Your firm handles my corporate structuring. You have attorney-client privilege. You have to help me fight this. They are freezing my accounts. I need an emergency injunction." The lawyer yanked his arm out of Julian's grip with violent force. "We represent Sterling Capital Management," the lawyer corrected him coldly. "And according to the document that woman just put on the table, you do not represent Sterling Capital anymore. We work for the board, Julian, and the board just fed you to the FBI. Good luck finding a public defender who understands offshore tax evasion." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The remaining VIP guests piled inside, not looking back. The steel doors closed, severing Julian's last remaining ties to high society wealth and freedom. The silence that fell over the penthouse this time was absolute and crushing. The jazz trio in the corner had quietly packed up their instruments and slipped out the service elevator minutes ago. The catering staff had vanished. The room, which had been bustling with the elite of Atlanta, was now completely hollowed out. Julian stood alone in the center of the living room, staring at the closed elevator doors. His shoulders were slumped, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut. The illusion was dead. The prestige was gone. The white privilege that had insulated him for so long had violently expired. Chloe stood frozen near the panoramic window, her hands covering her mouth. She had watched her entire social empire disintegrate in less than 5 minutes. The wealthy friends she had bragged about, the elite network she had used to humiliate me, they had all run for their lives the moment the facade cracked. They did not care about her. They only cared about the proximity to power, and that power had just been legally annihilated. "Julian," Chloe whimpered, taking a hesitant step toward her husband. "Julian, what are we going to do? Tell me we still have the offshore accounts. Tell me we can just leave the country." Julian turned slowly to look at his wife. The look of utter contempt on his face was chilling. He did not see a partner. He saw a liability. "Shut up, Chloe!" Julian snapped, his voice venomous and raw. "Just shut your mouth. There are no offshore accounts. The Fed seized the routing numbers this morning. I have absolutely nothing left." He spun around to face my parents, his eyes wide and manic. He pointed an accusatory finger at my mother, who was leaning heavily against my father, openly weeping. "This is your fault," Julian screamed, advancing on my parents. "If you had just wired the money to my personal Cayman account instead of the domestic holding trust, the feds would not have flagged the transfer. You stupid, incompetent fools. You moved the money too slowly. You ruined everything." My father stepped in front of my mother, his fists clenched though his entire body was shaking with fear. "Do not speak to my wife that way," Marcus Jr. demanded, his voice lacking any real authority. "We gave you everything we had. We gave you our daughter trust fund. We committed a crime for you. And you failed!" Julian roared back, his face inches from my father. "You wanted to be part of the elite. You wanted to buy your way into my world. You handed over the cash because you are pathetic social climbers who would sell your own souls to look rich. You are just as guilty as I am, Marcus. When the FBI kicks that door down, they are taking you right along with me." The absolute betrayal in Julian's words struck my parents like a physical blow. The man they had worshipped, the son-in-law they had prioritized over their own flesh and blood, was now actively threatening to throw them to the federal wolves to save his own skin. He felt zero loyalty to them. He never had. I watched the scene unfold with cold, detached satisfaction. This was the poetic justice of terrible investments. When you build your life on a foundation of lies and prejudice, the collapse is never quiet. It is a spectacle of mutual destruction. I stepped forward, picking up the crisis management contract from the glass table. I folded it neatly and slipped it back into the manila envelope. I had completed the first phase of the operation. Julian was socially and professionally dead. The VIPs were gone. The board had fired him. The FBI was en route. But I was not finished. The most important reckoning was still waiting to be delivered. I turned my gaze away from the pathetic hyperventilating fraud in the center of the room and locked eyes directly with the people who had actually stolen from me. I shifted my gaze from the hyperventilating ruined man in the center of the room and looked directly at my sister. Chloe was staring at her husband as if he had just mutated into a monster right before her eyes. The man who was supposed to be her golden ticket to high society had just screamed in our parents' faces and openly admitted he was a cornered federal criminal. But Chloe did not rush to his side to comfort him. She did not ask him if he was okay. In the face of absolute catastrophic ruin, Chloe reverted to the only survival tactic she actually understood. She found someone else to blame. She pivoted sharply, her expensive silk gown whipping around her ankles, and marched straight toward our mother. "How could you be so utterly useless?" Chloe shrieked. Her voice reached a pitch so high and shrill that it made the crystal glasses on the nearby wet bar vibrate. "You had one job. You just had to move the money. Julian told you exactly what to do and you ruined my entire life." Patricia reached out her hands, shaking uncontrollably as she tried to placate her furious golden child. "Chloe, sweetie, please listen to me. We tried our best. We did exactly what he asked. The bank put a security hold on the transfer. We pushed it through as fast as we could." Chloe slapped our mother's hands away with violent, ungrateful force. "Do not touch me. You promised me this was handled. You promised me I would not lose my house or my status. Now all my wealthy friends are gone, my husband is going to federal prison, and I have absolutely nothing. You destroyed me." Having exhausted her rage on our parents, Chloe spun around, her wild mascara-stained eyes locking onto my grandfather. She saw the silver-handled cane. She saw the stoic patriarch of the Davenport family. Most importantly, she saw a walking, breathing bank vault. She rushed toward him, her heels sinking deeply into the plush white rug. She stopped just inches away from him, clasping her hands together against her chest in a posture of desperate theatrical prayer. "Grandpa Marcus, you have to fix this," Chloe pleaded. Tears were streaming heavily down her cheeks, completely ruining her perfect camera-ready makeup. "You have billions in liquid capital. $2 million is absolute pocket change to you. Just write a check. You can pay off the federal regulators. You can buy this penthouse right now to keep a roof over my head. You can make this all go away. Please, Grandpa, I am your favorite granddaughter. You cannot let me end up on the street with a criminal husband." Marcus Sr. did not move a single muscle. He looked down at Chloe with an expression of such profound glacial contempt that it practically lowered the ambient temperature in the room. "You are not my favorite granddaughter," he stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried absolute finality. "You are a spoiled, arrogant child who has spent her entire adult life mocking the only person in this family who actually possesses a work ethic. You stood there 10 minutes ago and insulted Maya. You called her a failure. You tried to have her thrown out by security. And now you expect me to liquidate my hard-earned assets to buy you out of a federal crime scene." He tapped his cane against the hardwood floor once, a sharp, echoing crack. "I built the Davenport legacy through decades of grinding, bleeding, and fighting in a world that desperately wanted to see me fail?" My grandfather continued, his gaze pinning her in place. "I did not build my empire to subsidize a white con artist and a granddaughter who thinks she is entitled to my wealth simply because she breathes. I would not give you a single red cent to buy a glass of water if you were dying of thirst. You made your bed with a thief, Now you get to sleep in a jail cell with him." Chloe let out a devastating, breathless wail. Her knees instantly buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the pristine white rug, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as her entire fabricated universe shattered into dust. Seeing their golden child completely broken on the floor, my parents finally understood the absolute gravity of their situation. The shield of Julian arrogance was permanently gone. Chloe entitlement had failed to save them. The FBI was hovering like a dark, inescapable shadow over the penthouse. My father looked at the manila envelope in my hand, then looked at his father. The sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes finally broke him in half. Marcus Jr., a man who had spent his entire life obsessed with social standing and looking down on others, dropped heavily to his knees. The thud of his kneecaps hitting the floor was sickeningly loud. A second later, Patricia sank down right beside him. Her emerald green designer gown pooled around her on the floor like a deflated parachute. They were kneeling. My parents were actually literally kneeling at our feet. "Dad, please!" My father begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He raised his trembling hands toward his father, tears streaming openly down his face. "We made a mistake. A horrible, catastrophic mistake. But you have to save us. If the FBI traces that wire transfer back to our personal accounts, we are going to federal prison. We will lose the family house. We will lose the cars. The Davenport name will be completely ruined." "Marcus, please listen to him." My mother sobbed, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. "We were just trying to help Chloe. We just wanted to make sure she was secure in her marriage. You cannot let them take us away in handcuffs. The public humiliation will literally kill me. Think of the family honor. Think of the legacy you built." I stepped forward, positioning myself directly between my kneeling parents and my grandfather. I looked down at them from my towering height, my midnight blue trench coat framing me like a judge about to deliver a final sentence. "The Davenport name is not going to be ruined," I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through their pathetic, echoing sobs. "Because I am the one holding it up. I am the one managing the crisis." They looked up at me, their eyes wide with a sudden, desperate flare of hope. They thought my words meant I was going to save them. They thought I was going to use my crisis management firm to cover up their monumental crimes. "Maya, thank God," my mother wept, reaching out to grasp the hem of my trench coat. "You can fix this. You can talk to the federal authorities. You can explain that Julian tricked us. You can get the $2 million back and make this go away. We will do whatever you say." I calmly reached down and peeled her fingers off my coat, dropping her hand back to her side with a look of absolute revulsion. "I am not going to get the money back, Patricia. The money you stole from me is completely gone. You wired it into a federal trap. And I am certainly not going to lie to the FBI to protect two people who actively embezzled my inheritance to fund my sister's fake lifestyle." My father's hopeful expression twisted back into pure, unfiltered terror. "Then what are you going to do?" he gasped, clutching his chest. "Why did you even come here if you are not going to help us?" "I came here to deliver a message," I stated, my eyes locked on his, ensuring he felt the full weight of his impending doom. "You begged Grandpa Marcus to buy this penthouse to save you from humiliation. You begged him to use his money to secure Chloe's future. But you are kneeling in front of the wrong person." I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to drop the final earth-shattering piece of the puzzle directly onto their heads. "Grandpa Marcus does not need to buy this penthouse," I said, letting a cold, lethal smile spread across my face. "Because someone else already did." The sheer confusion on their faces was almost pitiful to witness. My mother blinked rapidly, the heavy false eyelashes she wore fluttering as her mind struggled to process the words I had just spoken. My father remained on his knees, his hands still hovering in the air, looking between me and my grandfather with wide, bloodshot eyes. They were completely paralyzed, unable to bridge the gap between their desperate reality and the terrifying truth I was laying out before them. Grandpa Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and his kneeling son. He raised his silver-handled cane and brought it down hard against the pristine white rug. The muffled but heavy impact demanded absolute attention. "Get off your knees, Marcus." My grandfather commanded, his voice a low, thunderous rumble that vibrated with decades of hard-earned authority. Stand up. You are embarrassing the name I gave you. You are embarrassing the ancestors who bled so you could walk into rooms like this. Stand up before you make me sick. My father flinched as if he had been physically struck. He scrambled to his feet, his limbs shaking so violently he had to lean against a nearby accent table just to stay upright. My mother followed, pulling herself up from the floor, her emerald green gown now wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. They stood together, looking like two reprimanded children called into the principal office, completely stripped of their arrogant high society facade. You came to me begging for salvation, Grandpa Marcus said, his dark eyes locking onto his son. You want me to open my checkbook and buy this penthouse to cover up your monumental stupidity. You want me to save Julian from the consequences of his own federal crimes so you do not have to face the social humiliation of your country club friends finding out you married your daughter off to a con artist. My father swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly in his throat. Dad, please. It is not just about the social humiliation. It is about Chloe. She is going to lose everything. She is going to be on the street. She is going to learn how the real world works. My grandfather corrected him mercilessly. She is going to learn that wealth is not something you marry into by blinding yourself to the truth. But let us talk about this penthouse. Let us talk about this magnificent $10 million glass cage that Julian has been using to blind you all. Grandpa Marcus turned his gaze toward Julian, who was still leaning weakly against the wet bar. Julian looked like a cornered rat, his eyes darting frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. You really thought you were a master of the universe, Julian, my grandfather said, his tone dripping with sheer contempt. You brought my family up to this high rise, poured them expensive liquor, and convinced them you owned the sky. But you do not own a single square foot of this property. You leased it under a highly leveraged, convoluted corporate holding structure designed to hide your lack of actual capital. And when your fake hedge fund started bleeding out, you missed 3 consecutive rent payments. You have been in default for 90 days. Chloe gasped, spinning around to look at Julian. You told me we owned this place. You told me you bought it in cash. Julian did not answer her. He just stared at the floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. He lied to you, Chloe, Grandpa Marcus stated flatly. He lies to everyone because his entire existence is a fabrication. But let me educate you all on how high-end real estate actually functions in Atlanta. The developer of this residential high-rise relies on massive mezzanine financing to keep these ultra-luxury units afloat. When tenants like Julian inevitably default on their exorbitant leases, the developer has to answer to their primary creditors to avoid their own bankruptcy. My grandfather took another step forward, planting himself in the dead center of the living room. He exuded absolute, terrifying control. And who do you think holds the primary mortgage debt for this entire building? He asked, looking directly at my father. Who do you think underwrote the loans that built this very floor you are standing on? My father's eyes widened in sudden, horrifying realization. Davenport Holdings, he whispered, his voice trembling. Precisely, Grandpa Marcus said, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. I have owned the paper on this building since before Julian even signed the lease. I approved the development loans. I watched him bring my granddaughter up here, parading her around like a trophy, feeding my own son and daughter-in-law. Delusions of grandeur, all while he was actively defaulting on the debt he owed to my subsidiary company. He has been living in my house this entire time. The revelation hit the room with the force of a wrecking ball. Julian's arrogant white supremacist illusion of superiority was entirely shattered. He had spent years looking down on our family, treating my parents like gullible peasants, while he was literally a delinquent tenant living on the grace of a black man real estate empire. He was nothing but a squatter in a tailored suit. Patricia let out a desperate, strangled cry. She threw her hands up, stepping toward my grandfather with a renewed, frantic hope. But that is perfect. Marcus. If you own the debt, you can forgive it. You can cancel the default notices. You can transfer the deed to Chloe. You have the power to fix this right now. If Julian goes to prison, at least Chloe will still have the penthouse. You can save her. Grandpa Marcus slammed his cane down again, shutting her up instantly. I will not lift a single finger to save a man who steals from innocent people, he roared, his voice bouncing off the glass windows. And I will absolutely never use my hard-earned wealth to bail out a son and a daughter-in-law who actively embezzled $2 million from their own child. You handed Maya future to a thief, Patricia. You signed the wire transfer that robbed her blind. Do not ever ask me for mercy. You deserve every ounce of the ruin that is crashing down on you tonight. My mother recoiled, burying her face in her hands as fresh agonizing sobs racked her body. The realization that there would be no patriarchal bailout had completely destroyed her final shred of hope. But even if I wanted to help you, my grandfather continued, his voice dropping back to a cold, clinical cadence. Even if I suddenly lost my mind and decided to forgive the debt on this property, I cannot do it. My father wiped his face with a trembling hand, looking up in sheer confusion. What do you mean you cannot do it? You just said Davenport Holdings owns the primary debt. You own the building. I did own it, Grandpa Marcus corrected him. But keeping toxic assets on my books is bad business. When Julian defaulted, the developer forfeited the collateral to me. I had total control of this penthouse. But as of 48 hours ago, Davenport Holdings no longer owns the debt profile for this specific property. Julian's head snapped up. His eyes, completely devoid of their previous arrogance, were now wide with absolute panic. You sold it. Julian gasped, his voice raspy and weak. You sold the debt. To who? A bank. A collection agency. My grandfather smiled. It was the same lethal, predatory smile I had given Julian just moments before. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey realize it is trapped in a cage. I did not sell it to a bank, Julian. Grandpa Marcus said, his tone dripping with dark, poetic justice. I sold it to a highly motivated private third-party buyer, someone who paid the outstanding balance in pure cash and demanded the immediate, irrevocable transfer of the deed and all eviction rights. My father stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the wall for support. Who? Marcus Jr. pleaded, his voice breaking. Who did you sell it to? Grandpa Marcus did not answer. He simply stepped aside, clearing the path between my parents and me. He leaned his weight onto his silver-handled cane and looked at me with immense, undeniable pride. I stood there in my midnight blue trench coat, holding the heavy manila envelope containing their federal doom. I did not say a word immediately. I just watched their terrified eyes slowly shift from my grandfather to me. I watched their brains struggle to process the monumental, catastrophic shift in power that had just occurred. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to marinate in the absolute dread of what was coming next. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sharp click of my stiletto heels breaking the suffocating silence. My parents stared at me, their faces contorted in a mixture of disbelief and absolute terror. They were trying desperately to process the impossible equation my grandfather had just laid out. They simply could not compute how the daughter they had systematically discarded could possibly be the executioner standing at the gates of their social destruction. I let a cold, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of pure, concentrated victory. It is me, I stated. My voice did not need to be loud to command the room. It resonated with the absolute certainty of a woman who held every single card in the deck. I bought the debt. I am the private third-party buyer. My mother let out a small, choked gasp. She clutched her hands to her chest, shaking her head as if physically trying to reject reality. No, that is impossible, she stammered, her voice frantic. You cannot afford a property like this. You just run a little agency. You do not have that kind of capital. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I just looked at her with profound pity. That is the tragedy of your entire existence, Patricia, I said smoothly. You were so blinded by Julian White's skin and his expensive suits that you never bothered to actually look at my balance sheets. You never asked about my corporate retainers. You never realized that while Julian was busy faking a billionaire lifestyle with stolen money, I was quietly securing massive multi-year contracts with Fortune 500 companies. I turned my gaze to Julian. He was gripping the edge of the bar, his knuckles white, his chest heaving as he stared at me in sheer horror. "You called me a glorified event planner, Julian," I reminded him, throwing his own arrogant words right back in his face. "You said I played in a sandbox. You mocked my business because I clean up internet gossip. But the truth is, I run one of the most profitable crisis management firms on the East Coast. My agency generated over $15 million in pure liquid profit last year alone." Julian's jaw dropped. His eyes widened, completely short-circuiting as his brain tried to calculate the wealth standing right in front of him. So when Grandpa Marcus mentioned that the primary debt profile for this penthouse was going into default, I did not have to ask a bank for a loan. I continued taking another step closer to him. I did not have to siphon money from a teacher's pension fund. I did not have to forge wire transfers or steal from my family. I just logged into my corporate account, authorized a clean, perfectly legal wire transfer, and bought the debt outright in cash. I own the paper. I own the eviction rights. I own the very floor you are bleeding on right now. Chloe let out a devastated sob. She collapsed further into herself, wrapping her arms around her knees as she rocked back and forth on the white rug. The golden child, the sister who had spent 32 years looking down on me, was now physically beneath my feet. But Maya Chloe wept, looking up at me with mascara-stained cheeks. "You are my sister. You cannot do this. You cannot throw me out on the street. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do?" I looked down at her. I thought about the live stream from earlier tonight. I thought about the 50,000 followers she had entertained by mocking my Thanksgiving dinner. "You are going to do exactly what you told me to do 30 minutes ago, Chloe," I replied, my voice echoing like ice cracking over a frozen lake. "You told me to turn around and go back to my lonely little life. You told me I did not belong in this $10 million penthouse. You were absolutely right. I do not belong here. Because I have a custom-built $15 million estate in Buckhead waiting for me. An estate that is fully paid for. An estate that does not have the FBI sitting outside its gates." I crouched down slightly so I was closer to her eye level. "You built your entire identity on being superior to me," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "You married a fraud because you were too lazy to build your own empire and you wanted a shortcut to the top. You laughed at me while you spent my stolen trust fund. Now you have no money, no status, and a husband who is about to trade his tailored suits for a federal prison uniform. You are going to pack whatever cheap clothes you can carry, and you are going to leave my property." My father let out a loud, agonizing groan. He grabbed his hair, pulling at the graying strands as the absolute finality of the situation crushed him. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a salvation he did not deserve. "Maya, please," my father begged. "We made a mistake. We were stupid. We were greedy. But we are your parents. You cannot destroy us like this. We will pay you back the $2 million. We will sell the house. We will do whatever it takes. Just please do not let them send us to jail." "You still do not get it, do you, Marcus?" my grandfather interjected, stepping up beside me. He looked at his son with an expression of absolute disgust. "You cannot pay her back. You do not have any assets left to sell. Julian leveraged everything you own. And Maya does not need your money. She just showed you she can buy and sell you 10 times over before breakfast. This is not about the money anymore. This is about the consequences of your treacherous, toxic loyalty to a white con artist." I stood back up, adjusting the lapels of my trench coat. My grandfather was right. The money was irrelevant now. I had walked into this building looking for blood, and I had found an entire slaughterhouse waiting for me. I reached into the manila envelope and pulled out a single, neatly folded document. It was not a federal indictment, and it was not a crisis management contract. It was a formal, legally binding notice of immediate eviction, stamped and authorized by a Fulton County judge just 3 hours ago. I dropped the eviction notice onto the glass coffee table right next to Julian's termination contract. "I am not destroying you, Dad," I said calmly. "You destroyed yourselves. You chose your side. You chose to protect a criminal because you coveted his proximity to white wealth. You threw your own black daughter to the wolves because you thought I was a peasant. Now the wolves are here, and they are wearing federal badges. I turned my back on my parents and looked squarely at Julian. He was practically vibrating with terror, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence had been completely eradicated. He was nothing but an empty, terrified shell. "You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property, Julian," I commanded. "I am seizing all assets within these walls to cover your outstanding debt. You can take your clothes and your personal documents. If there is a single piece of furniture missing when my management team arrives tomorrow night, I will personally add grand theft to your federal indictment list." I did not wait for his response. I did not need to hear his excuses or his pathetic apologies. The trial was over, and the execution had been flawless. I turned to my grandfather. He gave me a single approving nod. It was the highest praise a Davenport could receive. He tapped his cane against the marble floor one last time, a final period at the end of a devastating sentence. "Let us go, Maya," Grandpa Marcus said, turning toward the foyer. "The air in here reeks of failure." I followed him, the sound of my stilettos clicking sharply against the floor. I did not look back. I did not look at my mother weeping on the rug, or my father staring blankly at the wall, or my sister clutching a diamond ring that was about to be repossessed. I left them exactly where they belonged, in the wreckage of their own making. As I reached the polished steel doors of the private elevator, my father's desperate voice shattered the heavy silence one last time. "Maya, wait." He scrambled to his feet, stumbling forward, but stopping abruptly when my grandfather turned his head. "The $2 million. The wire transfer. If the FBI raids this place, they will audit Julian inbound accounts. They will trace the money right back to your mother and me. You know the federal prosecutors in this district. You have crisis contacts. You have to scrub our names from that transaction before the raid happens." I paused, resting my hand on the cool metal of the elevator frame. He was not apologizing for stealing my future. He was only begging me to cover up his sloppy tracks. He still viewed me as a tool to be used for the family convenience, a cleanup crew for their monumental failures. I turned to face him, my expression completely void of mercy. "Scrub your names," I asked, my voice cutting through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. I reached into the deep pocket of my trench coat and retrieved a small, encrypted black flash drive. "Dad, who do you think handed the federal prosecutors the map to your bank accounts in the first place?" My mother let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her throat. Her emerald green gown suddenly looked like a prison uniform. "My forensic accountants did not just flag the theft for my personal amusement," I explained, holding the flash drive up to the light. "When I realized you forged my signature to drain the trust fund Grandpa Marcus built for me, I instructed my legal team to compile every digital footprint, every timestamp, and every IP address associated with that transfer. You did not just steal from me. You committed wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to launder illicit funds. I bundled your grand larceny into a neat, undeniable package." I tossed the flash drive through the air. It landed perfectly in the hands of the lead security guard standing in the foyer. "When the FBI tactical team breaches that door, give them that drive," I instructed the guard, my tone absolute and authoritative. "It contains the missing domestic link to Julian's Sterling wire fraud network. The people weeping on that rug are not victims. They are his primary co-conspirators." The guard nodded sharply, slipping the drive into his tactical vest. He straightened his posture, recognizing exactly who was signing his paychecks now. My father fell back against the glass wall, his chest heaving as the final fatal nail was driven into his coffin. There was no loophole. There was no PR spin. His own daughter had just officially delivered him to the federal government. "You are sending your own flesh and blood to prison," Patricia wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her impending reality. "You are a monster." "I am the consequence of your actions," I corrected her coldly. "You sent yourselves to prison the second you decided my inheritance was collateral damage for Chloe's fake luxury lifestyle. You made your bed with a criminal, Patricia. Now you get to share his cell." I looked past my ruined parents to where Julian and Chloe remained paralyzed near the wet bar. Julian has 24 hours to vacate the premises because local tenant laws require a formal notice period. I announced, my voice echoing across the devastated penthouse. But Patricia, Marcus, and Chloe, you are not on the lease. You are unauthorized guests on my private property. I looked at the lead security guard. They have exactly 10 minutes to collect their coats and walk out the front door. If they are still standing on my hardwood floors at minute 11, you have my full authorization to physically remove them for trespassing. Chloe let out a devastated broken sob, clutching her husband's arm, but Julian just shoved her away, staring blankly at the floor. The golden child was finally completely alone, stripped of her wealth, her pride, and her protectors. She was a queen of a kingdom built on sand, and the tide had just violently rolled in. I stepped backward into the mirrored elevator cab, taking my place beside my grandfather. The physical distance between us and the wreckage of my family felt like a massive, unbridgeable chasm. The elevator chimed softly. The heavy steel doors began to glide shut. Through the narrowing gap, the visual of their total destruction was perfectly framed. It was a masterpiece of karmic justice. My mother was kneeling on the floor, weeping into her hands. My father was clutching his chest, staring at the flash drive in the guard pocket with utter despair. Julian was a hollow shell waiting for the federal sirens to signal the end of his life. And Chloe, the sister who had live-streamed her arrogance to 50,000 people just an hour ago, was sitting in the ruins of a life that never really belonged to her. The power dynamic was absolute and undeniable. They were trapped in a cage of their own boundless greed, small, broken, and terrified. Meanwhile, I stood tall, wrapped in my midnight blue armor, ascending to the throne they had tried so desperately to deny me. The doors locked shut, with a definitive, satisfying click, severing them from my world forever. The ride back to Buckhead was wrapped in a comfortable, triumphant silence. My grandfather did not need to speak, and neither did I. The war was over, and the victor had already claimed the spoils. When the Maybach pulled up to the gates of my estate, I stepped out into the crisp autumn night, breathing in the scent of pine and absolute freedom. I walked back through the heavy double doors of my mansion. The grand foyer was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt entirely mine. I made my way into the dining room, where the lavish $15,000 Thanksgiving feast still sat untouched. The roasted turkey was cold. The artisan breads had settled. Hours ago, looking at this table had broken my heart. Now, looking at the pristine crystal and the fine china, I only saw the undeniable proof of my own extreme capability. I reached for the decanter of vintage Bordeaux, poured myself a fresh glass, and walked slowly into the expansive living room. The modern fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm, golden glow across the velvet furniture and the curated art on the walls. I sat down on the center sofa, letting the heavy, midnight blue trench coat fall open. I took a slow sip of the wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor. For 32 years, I believed that my family rejection was a reflection of my own inadequacy. I thought that if I worked harder, dressed better, or achieved more, they would finally pull out a chair for me at their table. I let their conditional love dictate my self-worth. I let their toxic obsession with social status make me feel like a permanent outsider in my own life. They thought that leaving an empty chair at their dinner would break me. They thought that excluding me was the ultimate punishment. But they fundamentally misunderstood how power works. Exclusion is only a punishment if you actually value the people shutting you out. As women, and especially as Black women, society conditions us to wait for an invitation. We are taught to be grateful for the scraps, to shrink ourselves so we do not intimidate the fragile egos in the room, to seek validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of recognizing our brilliance. We spend years knocking on doors that were locked from the inside, begging for a seat at a table that is structurally unsound. I am done knocking. I am done waiting for permission to take up space. If they refuse to give you a seat at their table, you do not just bring a folding chair. You build your own table. You build your own agency. You build your own multi-million-dollar empire. You buy the very ground they stand on, and you evict every single person who ever made you feel like you were not enough. I looked around my magnificent $15 million fortress. There were no fake friends here. There were no federal criminals, no enablers, and no golden children. There was only peace, absolute financial sovereignty, and the unshakable knowledge that I had saved myself. I raised my crystal glass to the quiet room, to the toxic family I had finally cut loose, and to the absolute queen I had become. Cheers! The screen fades to black as a powerful bass-heavy instrumental track swells and consumes the silence. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about claiming your power and defining your own worth.